Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. And if you're new here, please subscribe, because today we're talking about something incredibly important that affects millions of people but often goes unrecognized: how childhood trauma shows up in adulthood. And I want to be clear from the start. When we talk about childhood trauma, we're not just talking about the extreme cases that most people imagine. Yes, trauma includes things like abuse, neglect, or violence. But it also includes emotional invalidation, unpredictable parents, divorce, bullying, loss of a caregiver, growing up with addiction in the home, being the parentified child who had to care for younger siblings or emotionally support adults, or simply growing up in an environment where you didn't feel safe, seen, or loved. Trauma is just about what happened to you. Also about what did happen that should have, like consistent support, validation, and security. And here's what makes childhood trauma so insidious. The effects don't stay in childhood. They ripple forward into every aspect of your adult life, in ways that can be confusing, subtle, and often invisible even to you. You might be struggling with patterns in relationships, work, emotional regulation, or self-perception, without realizing these patterns are rooted in adaptations you made as a child to survive an environment that was unmeeting your needs. So, today we're breaking down the specific ways childhood trauma manifests in adulthood, why these patterns develop, and why understanding this connection is absolutely crucial for healing. Let's start with one of the most profound and widespread effects: attachment issues and relationship patterns. As children, our relationships with our primary caregivers become the template for how we understand relationships, connection, trust, and love. These early experiences wire our brains and nervous systems in specific ways, creating what attachment theory calls our attachment style. If your caregivers were consistently available, responsive, and attuned to your needs, you likely developed secure attachment, learned that people are generally trustworthy, that your needs matter, and that relationships are safe. But if your early experiences were different, if caregivers were inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, rejecting, frightening, or overwhelming, you developed insecure attachment patterns as an adaptation. In adulthood, this shows up in specific, predictable ways. Anxious attachment, which often develops when caregivers were inconsistently available, manifests as fear of abandonment, constant need for reassurance, difficulty trusting that people will stay, jealousy, people-pleasing, and a tendency to lose yourself in relationships. Avoidant attachment, which often comes from having emotionally distant or rejecting caregivers, shows up as difficulty with intimacy and vulnerability, discomfort with emotional closeness, tendency to withdraw when things get serious, hyperindependence, and fear of being trapped or losing autonomy. Disorganized attachment, typically from frightening or chaotic care, creates a pattern where you simultaneously crave and fear closeness, leading to push-pull dynamics in relationships where you panic both when someone gets too close and when they pull away. These are conscious choice. They read deeply ingrained nervous system responses that developed when your brain was most malleable and learning how relationships work. Next, let's talk about emotional regulation difficulties, which is one of the most common manifestations of childhood trauma. As children, we learn how to manage emotions primarily through co-regulation with caregivers. They help us calm down when we're upset. They validate our feelings. They model healthy emotional expression, and they create safety that allows our nervous system to develop resilience. But if your caregivers couldn't or didn't do this, maybe they were overwhelmed themselves. Maybe they dismissed your emotions. Maybe your emotions scared them or made them angry. You never learned how to regulate your own emotional states effectively. In adulthood, this shows up as intense emotional reactions that feel disproportionate to situations. Difficulty calming yourself down once you're upset. Emotional numbness or disconnection. Rapid mood swings. Using substances or behaviors to manage feelings. Difficulty identifying or naming emotions, or getting completely overwhelmed by feelings that other people seem to handle. You're not broken or overreacting. You literally didn't receive the developmental support needed to build robust emotional regulation skills. and your nervous system is still operating with the limited toolkit you developed as a child trying to survive. Let's discuss chronic shame and negative self-concept, because this is perhaps the most painful legacy of childhood trauma. Children are naturally egocentric, meaning they interpret everything as being about them or caused by them. So, when bad things happen, parents fight, a parent leaves, they re-neglected or hurt children, do you, and think, my parent has problems, or this situation is dysfunctional. They think something must be wrong with me. I must be bad. I must be unlucky. This is especially true if adults explicitly blamed you, told you that you were too much or not enough, or communicated through their actions that you were a burden. These experiences create core beliefs about yourself that become the lens through which you see everything. In adulthood, this shows up as pervasive feelings of being fundamentally flawed or defective, harsh inner critic that attacks you constantly, difficulty accepting compliments or believing positive things about yourself, shame about your needs or emotions, apologizing excessively, belief that you don't deserve good things, self-sabotage when things are going well, and constant comparison to others where you always come up short. The child-esque conclusion, I am not lovable, becomes the adult-esque reality, because you filter all experiences through that lens, and often unconsciously create situations that confirm it. Now, let's talk about hypervigilance and difficulty feeling safe, which is the body's response to growing up in an unpredictable or unsafe environment. When you rear a child in a home where you never know if your parent will be loving or angry, where there's violence or chaos, or where your needs are unpredictably met or ignored, your nervous system learns to stay in a constant state of alert. Your threat detection system becomes hypersensitive because it has to be your survival depended on reading moods, anticipating danger, and staying prepared for the worst. In adulthood, this manifests as constant scanning of environments and people for signs of threat, difficulty relaxing or being present, startled response to normal sounds or movements, trouble sleeping, interpreting neutral situations as threatening, needing to control situations to feel safe, difficulty trusting even when people prove themselves trustworthy, and exhaustion from living in a perpetual state of low-level stress. Your nervous system is stuck in survival mode because it learned that the world isn't safe. And no amount of logical knowledge that you're safe now can convince your amygdala otherwise at S, operating on the programming from childhood. Let's discuss people-pleasing and boundary issues, which are incredibly common manifestations of childhood trauma. If you grew up in an environment where keeping the adults around you happy was crucial for your emotional or physical safety, where expressing your own needs resulted in rejection or anger, or where you had to prioritize others' feelings over your own, you learned that your value comes from what you provide to others. You learned that saying no is dangerous, that your needs don't matter as much as others' needs, and that maintaining connection requires self. In adulthood, this shows up as chronic difficulty saying no, even when you're overwhelmed, taking responsibility for other people's emotions, over-explaining and justifying your decisions, feeling guilty when you prioritize yourself, attracting relationships where you give far more than you receive, difficulty knowing what you actually want because you're so focused on what others want, and feeling resentful but unable to change the dynamic. You're not just being nice or accommodating you, reoperating from a trauma response that learned people-pleasing was a survival strategy. There's also perfectionism and fear of failure, which often develops as a response to conditional love or criticism in childhood. If your caregiver's love, attention, or approval was tied to your achievements, if you were criticized more than encouraged, or if mistakes resulted in harsh consequences, you learned that your worth is performance-based, and that being anything less than perfect means being unlovable or unsafe. In adulthood, this manifests as impossible standards for yourself. Procrastination driven by fear of not doing something perfectly. All-or-nothing thinking, feeling like a fraud despite accomplishments. Difficulty starting projects because they might not be perfect. Brutal self-criticism when you make mistakes. An inability to enjoy achievements because you're already focused on the next goal. The perfectionistic voice in your head is often your internalized critical caregiver, and you're still trying to earn the approval that should have been freely given when you were a child. Let's talk about difficulty with trust and vulnerability, Because childhood trauma teaches you that opening up or depending on others is dangerous. If the people who were supposed to protect you, hurt you, betrayed your trust, used your vulnerabilities against you, or weren't there when you needed them, you learn that showing your true self or relying on others leads to pain. In adulthood, this shows up as keeping people at arm's length, even when you crave connection. Difficulty asking for help even when you need it. Testing people or expecting them to prove themselves repeatedly. Self-reliance to an isolating degree. Sharing surface-level information but guarding your deeper feelings. Expecting betrayal or abandonment. And sabotaging relationships before they can hurt you. It is not that you do not want connection. Do desperately do, but your nervous system has learned that connection equals danger. So it throws up walls to protect you, even when those walls keep out exactly what you need. There's also the pattern of recreating trauma dynamics, which seems counterintuitive but is extremely common. People who experienced childhood trauma often find themselves in adult situations or relationships that mirror their early experiences, choosing partners who are emotionally unavailable like their parents were, ending up in work environments that feel chaotic or unsafe, or gravitating toward people who treat them the way they were treated as children. This happens for several reasons. These dynamics feel familiar, and familiarity feels like home even when it is dysfunctional. You're unconsciously trying to master the original trauma by replaying it with a different outcome. You don't recognize red flags because they feel normal, and your nervous system has adapted to this level of stress, so calm, healthy dynamics actually feel uncomfortable or boring. You're not choosing these situations because there is something wrong with you. You're being pulled toward what your nervous system knows, and healing requires making the unfamiliar familiar and the familiar strange. Now let's discuss dissociation and disconnection, which are protective mechanisms that develop when emotions or experiences are too overwhelming to process. If childhood experiences were too painful, scary, or intense, your mind learned to disconnect from your body, from your emotions, from the present moment as a way to survive. In adulthood, this can manifest as feeling disconnected from your body or emotions, difficulty being present, feeling like you're watching your life from outside yourself, memory gaps from childhood, going through the motions without really feeling engaged, or numbing out when stress increases. This isn't something you redoing on purpose. It's an automatic response that your nervous system learned when staying present meant experiencing unbearable pain. Finally, let's talk about what you can do with this information, because understanding how childhood trauma shows up is just the beginning. First, please know that recognizing these patterns is not about blaming your parents or staying stuck in victimhood, about understanding the roots of your struggles so you can address them effectively. Therapy, particularly trauma-focused approaches like EMDR, somatic experiencing, internal family systems, or psychodynamic therapy, can help you process childhood experiences and rewire these patterns. Attachment-based therapy specifically addresses relationship patterns and helps you develop secure attachment, learning to reparent yourself, giving yourself the validation, comfort, and support you didn't receive is powerful. Building awareness of your triggers and patterns is crucial because you una change what you do una see. Finding safe relationships where you can practice new ways of connecting gradually retrains your nervous system. And please practice self-compassion. These adaptations made sense. Given what you experienced, they helped you survive, and you're not broken for having them. Healing is possible. These patterns can change, and your childhood doesn't have to determine your future. If this video resonated with you, please share it, because so many people are carrying unrecognized childhood trauma and need to hear this message. Drop a comment if you feel safe which pattern hit closest to home, and please reach out to a trauma-informed therapist if these issues are impacting your life. You deserve support, and healing is absolutely possible. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.